On behalf of the UNESCO IESALC International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean, we thank you all for joining this webinar to launch the report, Pathways to 2050 and Beyond, Findings from a Public Consultation on the Futures of Higher Education. To start today's program, we would like to welcome Andrew Augustine, Chair of UNESCO IESALC Governing Board. Over to you, Mr. Andrew Augustine.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants. Welcome to this launch event hosted by UNESCO International Institute for Higher Education, UNESCO IESALC. We are here today to present Pathways to 2050 and Beyond, Findings from a Public Consultation on the Futures of Higher Education, the Phase 2 report of the Institute's Futures of Higher Education project. As mentioned earlier on, my name is Andrew Augustine. I'm the chair of the governing board of UNESCO IESALC, and with me today is Mr. Sobhi Tawil, who is the director for Futures of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO headquarters. And together, we're pleased to offer some welcome or some brief remarks, opening remarks to you. In 2020, UNESCO IESALC initiated a project on the futures of higher education to stimulate creative and imaginative thinking and ideas about the futures of higher education to 2050 and beyond. The project takes a global perspective, nurturing discussions around the role of higher education as part of UNESCO's larger Futures of Education initiative through consultations with higher education experts, the general public, and youth. Recent years have seen phenomena such as the growth of private providers and privatization of publicly funded higher education institutions, the development of accreditation systems, increased access, and shift in how higher education is funded. Challenges and opportunities external to higher education systems, demographic shifts, political change, economic crisis, war and conflict, and most recently, the global pandemic have challenged higher education. Understanding how this phenomena, challenges and opportunities impact the futures of higher education is also a mission for UNESCO IESALC Futures of Higher Education to achieve. During phase 1 of the project in spring 2021, UNESCO IESALC provided a synthesis of consultations with 25 global higher education experts. The report, Thinking Higher and Beyond, discussed experts' viewpoints on the concept and purposes of higher education, its functions, and the ways in which higher education could fulfill its missions. The opportunities and challenges that may lie ahead on the path to 2050 was addressed at the end of the report. Following phase 1, UNESCO IESALC embarked on a journey to phase 2, opening up the opportunity to contribute to changing the futures of higher education through a major public consultation. During the consultation, people's opinions on the hopes, concerns, transformation, and contribution of futures, the higher education were collected. In this launch, the Institute will share the 4 pathways to 2050 and beyond that form the roots from which higher education in the futures will grow. The project team will also outline some of the key findings from responses to this very well-received public consultation. The team will emphasize UNESCO IESALC's advocacy for 5 new calls to action that could change the futures of higher education, taking an evidence-based approach from the findings from the public consultation. We have also invited a group of experts with our great honor, Professor Mpine Makoe from South Africa, Ms. Sherry Duan from China, and Dr. Carmela Chavez Irigoyen from Peru to respond to the report and offer the comments on the futures of higher education from a range of global perspectives. We look forward to taking questions from those of you participating today. We welcome you all once again to the launch of Pathways to 2050 and beyond. We hope you enjoy the session, and we strongly encourage you to access our report for further explanation or exploration after the session. Now over to you, Sobhi.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and very pleased to be here with you all, and to welcome all the participants together with Andrew and the team at IESALC, to welcome you to this launch of the report of the public consultation entitled Pathways to 2050 and Beyond. And as Andrew, you pointed out, the report of public consultation is an important piece of the Futures of Higher Education project at IESALC. It builds on the earlier expert report. If I'm not mistaken, will be followed by a consultation focusing also specifically on youth. And as was mentioned, it is also a key piece of the broader Futures of Education initiative at UNESCO. The initiative was launched in the Futures of Education initiative was launched in late 2019, just a little over 2 years ago. And mobilizing really a broad range of partners and networks and organizations and individuals in the spirit of a broad open consultation, and this alongside the work of a dedicated international committee comprised of experts from various domains. And the report was of the International Commission was released just earlier this month. A report now entitled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And it's just a word on that and how this fits with this project and this public consultation. The report of the International Commission is based on an initial premise that we face a dual challenge in education. And the first is that despite progress in expanded access to educational opportunity, we still see denial of the right to quality, relevant education for so many. Some of that almost part of historical exclusions, and for this reason we would need to transform education. We'd need to rethink our models. If we take just one figure at the level of upper secondary education, with worldwide the global average being only 1 in 2 students in upper secondary that actually complete that level, there is something to be asked about our models and approaches. So a first reason to transform education. But the second piece of the dual challenge is the current disruptions more than ever, and COVID-19 uncovered that even further, our interconnectedness, our interdependence, but also our vulnerabilities. And the disruptions, whether relative to the environment and climate change, we just had the COP conference, but also whether in terms of technological and digital transformations, democratic backsliding, and other challenges, that it's no longer about education needing to adapt to change, but education shaping the change that we want. And to do this, we need to transform education for these 2 reasons. We need a new social contract for education. Higher education has a key role to play in this as a piece of the educational ecosystem that needs to be transformed. but it must be, it must, the forging of this new social contract, and that's what the report of the International Commission is an invitation to do that together, to do that in an inclusive manner, and having the voices of experts, of decision makers, but also of youth and the general public is key. So it is an invitation, and this work as part of the futures of higher education, this public consultation, and if I'm not mistaken, the next phase, which will be a focus on youth, is a key part of that conversation and responding to the call of the International Commission. Thank you.
Thanks to Mr. Sobhi Tawil, Director of Future of Learning and Innovation at UNESCO, for your words. Next on the agenda, we will have the official launch of UNESCO IESALC report, Pathways to 2050 and Beyond, Findings from a Public Consultation on the Futures of Higher Education, followed by a conversation with a group of experts who will share their global perspectives on the futures of higher education from the regions, and also based on the newly launched report. After the presentations, the audience is welcome to submit questions to all the speakers in English or Spanish through the Zoom chat. We would like to invite the UNESCO IESALC Research and Analyst team to officially launch the report. Over to you, team.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to Andrew and to Sobhi for the warm and helpful opening remarks. We're going to show you a short presentation, and we'll just get that up, please, in full screen mode. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Sarah, just briefly confirm, can you see are we seeing the screen well from your side?
Yes, we're seeing
Excellent.
you and also the presentation.
Very good, excellent. Okay, so my name's Emma Sabzalieva. I'm a senior policy analyst at UNESCO IESALC, but I'm joined today by the team that's been working incredibly hard on this public consultation. So before we start, let me take the opportunity to thank our peer reviewers and the team of professionals who have been working with us to design the report, to translate the report, to disseminate the report, and of course our interpreters at today's event. So thank you very much to them. I'd also like to take a moment to say thank you and congratulations for their excellent efforts to our research and analysis team, some of whom you'll see shortly with me. So the team that's been working on this is Dan Abdasheva, Eglis Chacon, Jose Andres Cuadros, Daniela Gallegos, Luz Camara Caballero, Daniel Leis, Bosen Lililiu, Diana Morales. And as mentioned, Daniela, Eglis, Lily, and Luz will also be presenting with me today. So we're really very happy to be able to launch our report, Pathways to 2050 and Beyond, Findings from a Public Consultation on the Futures of Higher Education. So during our presentation, we will share some of the many insightful ideas from the public consultation and hopefully plant some seeds of thought for us all to reflect on. With today's launch, you'll be able to access our report in English and in Spanish as a downloadable document, as well as through a very exciting new development, an interactive web-based presentation of the findings. I'd also like to mention that in support of open science, we're also making the full data set publicly available for use by researchers, by learners, by policymakers around the world. So as has already been alluded to, our Futures of Higher Education project at IESALC is the Institute's contribution to the broader UNESCO initiative on the futures of education. We're delighted that Sobhi Tawil has been able to join us today and say a few words about UNESCO's overarching work in this area. We very much welcome the recent publication by the International Commission on the Futures of Education. It's a fantastic report. In English, it's called Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And in the report, it identifies higher education as one of the catalysts for this new social contract, which is so needed now in education. So as part of that, in our project on the futures of higher education, we're concentrating on thinking about ways that we can create visions for desirable futures. So moving beyond any idea of a new normal or business as usual. You'll hear us talk, like in the UNESCO initiative, about futures in the plural. So that's a way of identifying the multiple promising paths that may lie ahead. In our project, as mentioned, we've had 3 phases. The first, an expert consultation, culminated in the launch, in fact, exactly 6 months ago today, of the report Thinking Higher and Beyond, Perspectives on the Futures of Higher Education to 2050. And I can see in the room joining us today, we have some of those experts, and in fact, one is also speaking with us today. So that was a really wonderful piece of work. We also published, in addition to the report, the 25 concept notes written by our team of global higher education experts. Phase 2 of the project, this public consultation. Now that's what we're gathered here for today. And at the end of the presentation, we'll say a little bit more about the 3rd phase, which is coming up next.
For the public consultation, we developed a survey that asked participants to think ahead to 2050 and to tell us first what they're most hopeful about and what they are most concerned about as they imagine their futures in their future horizons. Then we extended this future thinking to the role that higher education can play in those futures. We asked respondents the same 2 questions that were asked in the expert consultations. How would you like higher education to be in 2050? And how could higher education contribute to better futures for all in 2050?
Once the survey was designed, the public consultation was open for 10 weeks between May and August 2021. It was an online survey that was open for everyone and was available in 4 languages: English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And additionally, some participants were able to submit their responses in Chinese. We designed a consultation using the principles of access, engagement, and flexibility to hear from as many people as possible. And as noted, the survey could be completed in multiple languages. There was a limited number of questions that did not require too much time to complete, and respondents had the opportunity to share their ideas using free text responses.
As a result of this global reflection on the futures of higher education, 1,199 valid responses from all world regions were analyzed. The interest in the consultation was very high, and we were delighted that people in 97 countries were able to participate. In terms of regional representation, just over half of respondents came from Latin America and the Caribbean, and a quarter from Asia and the Pacific. 13% from Europe and North America, and 4% from Africa and 1% from Arab states. People of all age shared their visions about the future in 2050. Most of them were people between ages from 31 to 60. And for every 3 women who responded the survey, 2 men participated in the public consultation.
Following our analysis of the respondent, this is how we visualize and imagine our pathway to 2050 and beyond. These form the foundation for our future, each pathway representing a route from which we can grow. The routes are all connected in terms of quality of life, social change, care of the environment, and development of technology. In quality of life, there are healthy human living well. Due to social change, we live in a society together. Through care of the environment, we inhabiting a flourishing planet that we take better care of, and where the advanced development of technology supports this harmonious relationship with the self, others, and nature.
From this foundation, we now move to exploring the different roles that higher education could play in 2050. Based on what respondents said, the report discussed higher education in 2050 in 4 main themes: higher education for all, student-centered, organization of knowledge, and connected at multiple levels. To make sure that respondents' voices were clearly heard throughout, we used direct quotes from the consultation in the naming of the themes in this part of the report.
The theme 1, higher education for all, means that in 2050, higher education will be available and affordable to everyone. Universities and colleges will be safe and welcoming spaces for all. More driven by social justice, higher education will be more inclusive and diverse in terms of learners, faculty, and staff. It will be more contextualized to current global challenges and be more practical and experiential to include various academic and cultural offerings. Widening access to higher education, however, will not come at the cost of quality. They will be parceled together as inclusion with quality. In 2050, higher education will nurture and nourish every student's talent and potential.
Have you ever wanted to choose your own time to complete a course and work at your own pace? For students of 2050, this will be the norm as higher education becomes more student-centered and driven by students' choices. Students will actively participate in home learning by choosing programs and courses according to their own interests and driven by their own personal growth. Students will develop skills for their life and skills for responsible citizenship that will be useful not only for them, but for their local communities and in protecting the environment. But it's not just about skill development. Students will also be driven by values-oriented action that will also be at the heart of higher education institutions' missions. This is a 2050 world in which society will be kinder and citizens will be more compassionate.
To make this happen, what changes might be needed in the organization of knowledge? For a start, learning will be everywhere, offered in multiple modalities and formats, happening at any time, online and offline, as formal degree programs and through informal learning. We need more emphasis on training good teachers in higher education, people who will be committed to values such as respect, empathy, and innovation, who take a creative approach to education and who have more freedom to choose how to teach courses. More emphasis will be placed on diverse knowledge and weight of knowing, teaching and learning. Thus, it widely accessible, focuses on the common good and on local and global needs. It's not only teaching what will change. Higher education will be underpinned by innovative research that has impact on society and is supported by governments.
Cutting across higher education functions, it will be connected at multiple levels, serving society in inclusive ways and helping to solve complex problems. Higher education institutions will improve the situation of the planet through educating students, through research, and by reaching out to the general population, because it will have a global context with local essence. Higher education will understand the challenge and opportunities of the local environment without attracting attention from global issues. All of this calls for higher education without borders, opening horizons, working collaboratively, and promoting academic mobility, all based on tolerance, respect, and the needs of diverse communities and the planet.
So this sets the scene for a range of desirable futures where higher education supports us and its communities in every step. Would you like to live in this world of 2050? Participants from all over the globe have an affirmative yes to this question. So how do we get from today to the futures envisaged by our respondents? Based on what we heard in the public consultation, we're putting forward 6 calls to action. These are invitations for everyone, for the 225 people tuning in today, for students, for teachers, for children, for adults, researchers, decision makers, leaders, and more. The first call is to advocate for the right to higher education. In the future, higher education's role for society and communities needs to be further expanded. For this, mechanisms that promote the attainment of this right must be in place.
Second, the right to higher education must go hand in hand with addressing the barriers that limit participation. Policy changes that support students in reaching their full potential and devising new ways to promote and finance higher education are some of the issues that should be targeted to achieve this.
Third, we need to be more active in opening up access to knowledge. We can start by translating knowledge into different languages, publishing in open access journals, making course content freely available, and using technology to reach remote communities. These are all highly pragmatic and achievable options that are already underway.
Fourth, we must collectively empower the next generations to express themselves and to take leadership in their own futures. Young people must be heard when we design higher education, because they are the ones who will benefit from it, and that they will set paths for those who follow them in the near future.
Fifth, we need to strive for higher education to be more relevant. We call on students and teachers to push for changes in higher education with support, guidance, and funding from civil society and policymakers.
Finally, although 2050 might seem unreachable, it is in fact closer than we might imagine. In fact, it's less than 30 years from now. That is why we advocate for everyone to become future thinkers, to anticipate the future challenges and put for change now.
Alongside other actions our institute is taking, we have also been inspired to take up the call to listen to the voices of the next generations. In this public consultation, we realized that youth participation was quite modest at about 20% of overall participation. Yet the youth of today are the citizens of tomorrow, and hearing their perspectives on the futures as well as higher education in these futures is critical. Today, we're very pleased to officially announce that the next phase of the Futures of Higher Education project is a global youth consultation. Stay tuned for more insights and perspectives in 2022.
It's been really exciting to reflect on these visions of the futures, both today and in the recent months. And we do hope that some of the 1,200 people who participated in our public consultation have an opportunity to be here today and to hear back how we're reflecting some of the ideas that you've put forward. So those insights, those thoughts that have been shared in the public consultation are meant for further reflection and action. So with that in mind, we invite you to download the report, to engage with our interactive presentation of the findings, and to access the data set used in the public consultation. The links that we have through the QR codes that you can hold up, you'll see on the screen, those will take you to the resources on our site. They'll also be shared in the chat at the end of today's webinar. So again, thank you to everyone who completed the consultation, to the many colleagues, not everyone of whom I was able to name at the start of the presentation, but thank you all for their contributions. And thank you for coming to today's event. We're very excited now to continue the conversation, and we'll say thank you, and back to you now, Sarah.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to the research and analyst team for your presentation. And now it is the turn to our experts to dialogue with the report that we're launching today. And we would like to welcome our first higher education expert, Mpine Makoe. She is the Commonwealth of Learning Chair in Open Education Practices and Resources and a research professor in open distance e-learning at the University of South Africa, UNISA. She's actively involved in distance education associations nationally, regionally, and internationally, and she's a member of the University of the Futures Network. Mpine is a sought-after scholar and has published extensively in technology-enhanced distance learning and related fields. She has also done consultancy work for the Commonwealth of Learning, facilitating the development of ODEL policies in Africa. Professor Mpine Makoe, we would like to invite you to share with the audience your response to the report. Could you please tell us about how you see the futures of higher education from your perspective? You will have 5 minutes to respond. Over to you, Professor Makoe.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. And I'm really pleased to be with you today to share some of my thoughts with you about the futures of higher education. Well, the starting point is that the future of higher education needs to be visioned. And and congratulations to the report that we have received today that shows what it means and where people have their own hopes about higher education in 2050. My vision of higher education in 2050, as you rightfully asked, is that higher education should promote the concept of the global common good, where human beings coexist with the planet, coexist with each other. And this will also assist us in addressing some of the socially just education system that have put us in this place in the first place. And we are looking at higher education as something that will ensure that people have equitable access to quality education. And this should be embodied in the curriculum, and it also be embodied in the process of knowledge production. More often than not, when we talk about quality, we usually talk about issues of excellence, but quality is something that has to do with the fitness of purpose, whether the higher education system is addressing or is it relevant to the purposes at which it was created for. Now, it is very important, therefore, to shift from the discourses that promotes education where an individual is the one who comes up with all the ideas, to learning where the emphasis is on participatory processes. As you will remember, and in the report, as I was looking at the report, it was very clear that there should be social change. Everybody, every participant referred to social change as one of the most important principles of what education of the future will look like. And social change means people working together and sharing responsibilities as a collective. And I was very happy that they also identified student-centeredness. And as I was going through the report itself, I was thinking, maybe other people are not even thinking about this. And I wish the higher education sector could look at the report and see what the world is thinking about higher education. And it is important for us to address issues of higher education of the future or higher education in 2050. It has to address issues of environmental issues for us to even reach 2050. And the whole issue of coexisting with the planet. It also has to deal with addressing developmental issues, especially in countries that are not as well developed. It is absolutely important that we come up with homegrown development solutions, not solutions or development solutions modeled from other spaces that we are not familiar with. And the skills and training should take place through a series of technologically enhanced network. Technology has brought in another area where we need to look at and harness it for this space. We cannot continue to teach like we are teaching in an industrial period when we are dealing with education of the future. And in this education of the future, my vision is that it will be much more flexible. Students will have a choice to package what they want. It will be like going to a grocery shop where you choose what you want and put the basket, and that basket will give you what you need at the end. And that flexibility will allow higher education to be more responsive or even more relevant to what we are trying to do. The people who participated in the study showed that the vision of higher education in 2050 should address the social injustices that are inherent in our society: poverty, climate change, health issues, war and displacement of human beings, and many, many other issues that are top on the list of people who raised these concerns in this report. They also came up with their own hopes of the education that addresses the social justice mandate of equitable access to higher education, as well as inclusivity, where people can see themselves in the curriculum and they can be part of people who are generating knowledge and not knowledge to be in the preserve of the few. And I think I will just leave it at that. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Professor Makoe, for your insightful reflections. And we would like to welcome now Ms. Sherry Duan. She's a Senior Program Officer at the International Center for Higher Education Innovation, a UNESCO Category 2 center located in China. She works closely with higher education institutions and other stakeholders in the Asia-Pacific region to plan, organize, and implement ongoing projects and activities. Prior to ICHEI, she has experiences with several international organizations in the US, Hong Kong, SAR, and mainland China, working on higher education. She holds a master's degree in international educational development from Teachers College, Columbia University. Professor Duan, can you share with the audience from your perspective, how do you see the role of higher education in the futures? And what comments would you like to make about this new report? You will have around 5 minutes to respond. Over to you, Ms. Duan.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. So I'm particularly excited to read this article, this report, because coming from a background from literature, I'm very meticulous with words. So one thing that really caught my attention is the use of plural forms. So we see pathways, and then we also use beyond in terms of like 2050 and beyond. So regarding the first question that you just posed, like my view on the role of higher education, in fact, will be the plural form. So it will be the roles of higher education in the futures. For example, higher education will not simply seen as the foundation of development. We will also seen as an enabler, an accelerator, or an actor that will actually help the society move forward. So everything is interconnected. In terms of this report, I have many good things to say about. One thing, the first thing that I really like is, it builds on an expert review. So a public consultation is exactly what we need. We need to listen to what the people actually think about higher education, because higher education at the end of the day, it's for the people. It's not just for the experts, not for the policymakers, or not for people who work in higher education. It should be for people, different stakeholders who are involved in higher education. The other point, or the other key takeaway from reading this report, is the sub-theme of organization of knowledge. As shared by you, Sarah, in the introduction, that training good teachers, is very important during this process. Not only does it emphasize the importance of lifelong learners, but also really emphasize the process of learning. And this really echoes with what we do here at UNESCO ICHEI. While carrying out a wide range of activities, we really emphasize on the capacity buildings for teachers as well as institutions, because we do believe that teachers are the key actors in this process. We cannot simply just throw them with all the technology that they are supposed to use. In fact, we should also see them as someone who, like, teachers are also vulnerable in this process when the pandemic hit us. They are thrown into the situation where they are just asked to deliver classes online, which they probably haven't done that in the future in some part of the world. Therefore, I think it's very important that we recognize that teachers are also learners themselves. And it shouldn't be a shame to recognize that. It should be something that we all take pride in, because everyone needs to learn and everyone needs to keep on learning. And that's the kind of mindset that we should all have. Last but not least, I think I really like how this report is structured, coming from like collecting people's hopes and also looking at their concerns. And you realize that hopes and concerns are interconnected. There's no way just to look at hope and also just to look at concern. In fact, you have to look at both sides to figure out what are really needed and how we could redefine higher education. And I'll just stop it right there before we move on to the next expert. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Duan, for your participation. I would like to welcome now Dr. Carmela Chávez Irigoyen. She is a specialist on international higher education systems at Peru's National Superintendency of Higher University Education, SUNEDU, and PhD in sociology at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Her areas of interest include the sociology of higher education and comparative educational policy studies. She has studied institutional reforms, transformations in private higher education, and gender gaps in higher education. She's also a member of the Peruvian Society of Educational Research. I will switch now to Spanish, Doctora Chávez Irigoyen. And for those of you who are in English, you may want to turn the translation to your language in order to understand my question in Spanish to Doctora Chávez Irigoyen. Doctora, por favor, ¿podría compartir con la audiencia desde su perspectiva cómo ve el rol de la educación superior en el futuro en relación con los resultados de la encuesta, de la consulta pública y vinculado a su área de experticia? Tiene 5 minutos para responder. Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Bueno, antes que nada, muy buenos días a todos y todas los presentes. Muchas gracias por la invitación al Instituto, a Emma y a Sara por la organización. Creo también importante mencionar que el día de hoy conmemoramos el Día Internacional de la Lucha contra toda forma de violencia contra la mujer, reto que supone también algunas cuestiones vinculadas al campo de la educación superior, que podríamos conversar también más adelante, ¿no? Es importante entender también la perspectiva de género como una perspectiva que cruza de manera interseccional todos los temas vinculados a derechos humanos, ¿no? Y también muchas gracias a los comentarios de mis brillantes colegas panelistas que me antecedieron, ¿no? Yo tal vez comenzaría esta breve reflexión por una de las últimas partes situadas en el informe, cuando se señala que expectations for higher education in multiple ways are very high, ¿no? Y si eso ha sido normalmente así, en un escenario post-pandemia, ¿no? Cuyos impactos a nivel social, educacional, sociocultural, incluso interpersonal, creo que aún no terminamos de conocer, es muy refrescante, ¿no? He estado muy contenta de leer los resultados del informe, no solo porque está muy bien hecho, por supuesto, sino porque además da muchos mensajes que plantean, digamos, un horizonte de esperanza, ¿no? En un campo en el que también, y esto hay que decirlo, universidades, productores, digamos, elaboradores de políticas, hemos caído también muchas veces en unas lógicas a veces bastante credencialistas, bastante competitivas, frente a un escenario de una serie de discursos que vienen de los actores que más bien nos plantean retos en otro sentido, ¿no? Solo para mencionar algunas cifras gruesas mencionadas en el informe, ¿no? El 30% de los encuestados espera que la educación ayude a promover el bienestar. El 26% espera que esto aporte algo parecido a un proyecto de paz internacional, ¿no? El 20% menciona explícitamente una preocupación por inequidades y otro 20% espera que la educación ayude a promover la justicia social. Es decir, creo yo, y eso es algo que me tiene especialmente satisfecha de los resultados, es que estamos haciendo un giro de entender, digamos, a la educación no solo como un servicio, que es algo que está muy presente en los discursos de las propias universidades, hay que decirlo, e incluso de muchas políticas educacionales, sino también ir haciendo un regreso a una mirada más de entender a la educación como un derecho social y también como un poco en este horizonte, digamos, nuevo de discusión en términos de estas políticas redistributivas, cómo hacer que estos sistemas institucionales sean viables y sean inclusivos, ¿sí? Pero todo sin renunciar, por supuesto, a las exigencias propias de la producción de un conocimiento pertinente para las sociedades, ¿no? En ese sentido, creo que hay tres ideas que quisiera mencionar rápidamente que me desprenden del informe, ¿no? La primera es enfatizar esta necesidad de hacer un giro epistemológico, ¿no? En cómo concebimos el propio campo de la educación superior. Creo que es necesario ir pasando de esta mirada, como decía, más credencialista, que ha inundado mucho a la política educacional nacional e internacional, para ir volviendo tal vez a una mirada más de la deontología disciplinaria, de la responsabilidad social universitaria como ejes articuladores de la política y el quehacer universitario, ¿no? Eso supone darnos un trabajo de revisar currículas, de realizar contenidos y técnicas pedagógicas acordes a estas deontologías disciplinarias, ¿no? Incentivar políticas de investigación que permitan una mirada sostenibilidad social y ambiental, ¿no? Pienso en cosas tan básicas como cuántas carreras comerciales, por ejemplo, incluyen temáticas especializadas en comercio justo, digamos. Necesitamos empezar a hacer conversar estos nuevos paradigmas de sostenibilidad social y ambiental con lo que enseñamos propiamente en aula, ¿no? Pero eso supone también un trabajo de focalizar. Si queremos hacer un cambio de paradigma, algunos tendrán que salir y otros nuevos que tendremos que transformar, ¿no? Y hay una discusión interna en las comunidades educativas, qué se está dispuesto a mantener, qué se está dispuesto a transformar, ¿no? Pienso también en las lógicas de competitividad en la producción científica, cómo ir pasando, ¿no? De esta compulsión bibliométrica por los impactos, por encontrar cada vez más espacios de cooperación científica para la generación de un conocimiento pertinente de las necesidades de las comunidades, ¿no? Creo que ahí hay una tarea y una reflexión dispuestas por hacer, cómo generar un conocimiento abierto para aquellas, digamos, comunidades que efectivamente no están en posibilidades, y habría que discutir si alguna debería estar, de entrar en esta lógica también de, digamos, de lo que la literatura nos muestra de esa tendencia al capitalismo cognitivo, ¿cierto? Entender el conocimiento como una mercancía. Ahí hay un trabajo que hacer, ¿no? Lo otro tiene que ver con pensar y cada vez más a la educación superior como un derecho de manera integral, ¿no? Eso significa pensar también en la sostenibilidad de los propios sistemas institucionales para, entre otras cosas, incorporar a los nuevos perfiles de jóvenes y estudiantes, y también no tan jóvenes en esta mirada tan impulsada desde UNESCO de aprendizaje a lo largo del ciclo de vida, ¿no? Y pensar en la urgente necesidad de encontrar marcos nacionales de cualificaciones y otras herramientas de política pública que permitan la integración de la educación superior a diferentes niveles, ¿no? Pensar, y esto es algo urgente para regiones como América Latina, un proceso de masificación de la educación superior, pero que sea inteligente, ¿no? Incluir sin calidad termina reproduciendo sistemas de estratificación educativa. Creo que ahí también hay una tarea de inclusión de parte de nuestros gestores y también de nuestra clase política, porque, digamos, la educación también ha sido utilizada con un fuerte componente de, digamos, de utilizar este importante componente de inclusión social, pero si dejamos de lado los temas vinculados a la calidad, vamos a terminar reproduciendo desigualdades. Y finalmente, creo que también otro de los mensajes fuertes que salen, se desprenden del informe, tiene que ver con poner como centro de la preocupación en el campo de la educación superior a la comunidad universitaria, ¿no? Ya han mencionado también las otras colegas comentando la necesidad de volver a mirar a los docentes, a mirar a los estudiantes, ¿cierto? Como algo más de que personas, que recursos humanos, esta palabra tan horrorosa, ¿no? De entender que los docentes somos recursos humanos, somos capital, cuando en realidad también somos personas que trabajamos con personas. Creo que si algo nos ha dejado, digamos, esta experiencia traumática de la crisis sanitaria en muchísimos de nuestros países, ¿no? Tiene que ver con volver a mirar a las personas, a mirarnos como personas dentro de un sistema que finalmente forma ciudadanos, ¿cierto? No solamente transmite un conocimiento para operar un sistema productivo, sino que debe empezar a mirar y cada vez más a las sociedades y a los retos en los cuales se rodean, ¿no? Creo que ahí hay una cuestión importante por rescatar. Me alegra mucho que además el informe haya rescatado las voces de tantas mujeres que en el campo de la educación superior, si bien, digamos, en el campo de la educación en general estamos muy presentes, aún en el campo de la educación superior somos pocas. En América Latina, si bien hay muchas docentes universitarias mujeres, hay pocas autoridades, hay pocas decisoras en el ámbito público, y creo que ahí tenemos también un gap por ir llenando, y alegra mucho el saber que en esta encuesta hay una participación tan alta de mujeres. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctora Chávez Irigoyen, por su respuesta y además por mencionar la conmemoración el día de hoy del International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, que es oportuno para el tema que usted trae a colación, que tiene que ver con el género y la participación en la educación superior. We're having a little problem with the English channel, so we are taking care of that at the moment, but as we are starting to open up the Q&A session in order to answer the questions from the public, we're going to try, from the audience, we're going to try to post them both in Spanish and in English, so that, you know, in case you have any problem listening to the interpretation in either language, you can understand and respond to the questions. So I would love to, for this, to open the Q&A session, I would like to invite Emma Savsalieva, a senior policy analyst at UNESCO IESALC, to join me to moderate the questions that we are receiving from the audience. We have 253 people participating today, so you know we have many comments and questions in the chat. So we're gonna do our best to answer the ones that have not been answered through all these participations. So the first one, I'm gonna read it first in Spanish and then in English. And it is addressed to all of you. Todo lo que se ha planteado es muy cierto y de fundamental importancia, pero se requieren adecuados presupuestos para lograr los cambios que se han planteado. Sería bueno escuchar las opiniones de los expertos respecto de este tema. Everything that has been said is very true and of fundamental importance, but adequate budgets are required to achieve the changes that have been proposed. It would be good to hear the opinions of the experts on this subject. So I don't know who of our experts would like to start by answering the question. Thanks.
And Sarah, perhaps we could also bring into the view for participants, our speakers, just so that we can make this more of a kind of conversation at this stage of the session. So as we move into that way, so we invite any of the speakers from today to respond to the first question, which is sort of moving from the desirable futures to pragmatic, I suppose, the kind of the suggestion of, well, how do we finance this? What do we do about institutions or ideas that might challenge this notion of the global common good that's been put forward? So colleagues, we open the floor to you, to our speakers. Please join, and hopefully what we'll do is get everybody up on the screen so we can see everyone at the same time. So who would like to intervene?
I can start.
Please.
Okay. All right. I'll just give it a short. Thank you very much. This is the question that usually comes a lot about the funding. How do we fund this? And my question is, how did we find, or how are we funding what we already have right now? Because it's not something that is separate from what we are already having. What we are saying is that we need just to change the way we do things. We need to work on the curriculum. We already have the curriculum. We already have all these things in place. All we need to do is to change how we do things in the space that we are doing. It's not outside of the budget. What we need to do rather is to start focusing on what higher education should be doing. It's clear in the report and in everywhere that there's a need for change. In South Africa, students even protested for change because they felt that the education system that we have, it's irrelevant, it's colonized, it's all those things. All we need to do is to change the way we are doing things and not necessarily having to go and get extra funding from somewhere. That is not even there. But we are continuing to do what we are doing, even if it's not the right thing to do. That's my response to that question.
Thank you, Mpine. Would any of our other speakers like to come in? I can see we have our three speakers.
I'd like to just add in a little bit on top of what Mpine said. I really agree with her saying that, the first and foremost, it's not about just thinking about where to find the fundings. It's more about changing our mindset. I think as we enter the second, the third year of, the life with pandemic, it's really important for us to accept the fact that we're not going back to where we were before. We're actually entering this new phase of higher education. The higher education that we used to know of would not be the same. So the most important thing is about changing our mindset and being okay and being adaptive and responsive to the changes that we are surrounded. However, I do understand that coming from the perspective of some higher education workforce in the developing countries, that funding will be crucial because a lot of time they might be struggling with the infrastructure to begin with. But what I like to propose is a more optimistic mindset, because most of the time we're not looking for one single source of funding. There are actually diverse ways where we can look for fundings. For example, we can work with enterprises, we can work with other NGOs, and there are a lot more international organizations that are willing to lend hands in funding technology and also infrastructure that will be beneficial for higher education. So what we do is we change our mindset, we think out of the box and try to fund the projects. And that's what we'd like to add.
Excellent, thank you very much. Carmela, la palabra a ustedes.
Sí, yo quería mencionar que este es un punto clave, sobre todo en el caso de los sistemas altamente privatizados, ¿no? Yo vengo de un país donde hasta hace muy poco tiempo más del 70% de la matrícula, ¿no? Y de la oferta universitaria era dado en manos de privados, ¿no? Y donde teníamos además un fenómeno de expansión del sistema en un sistema privado de muy bajo, digamos, no solo de muy bajo costo, lo cual no debería ser necesariamente un problema, pero sí de muy baja calidad, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, el financiamiento público sigue siendo, digamos, una herramienta fundamental para la inclusión y para la calidad, que como digo, digamos, no es un falso debate, ¿no? Porque incluir sin calidad es lo mismo que no incluir. Entonces, en ese sentido, hay ahí, digamos, si bien año a año uno puede ver que muchos gobiernos, digamos, que estamos en estos estados de los ingresos medios, han aumentado en términos globales su presupuesto del financiamiento público, cuando uno lo ve en términos de inversión per cápita cápita hay efectivamente, digamos, menos recursos, ¿no? Entonces hay que tenerle una mirada un poco de ahí. Y lo otro es que también creo que hay que tener una inversión inteligente, ¿no? Con los recursos que siempre son escasos, digamos, ¿no? Para todo tipo de inversión pública, ¿no? Una inversión inteligente que implica pensar, por ejemplo, en niveles articulados de diversas formas de formación de educación superior. Necesitamos que cada vez más haya un diálogo entre la formación técnica, productiva, tecnológica, artística, pedagógica, universitaria. Todas ellas se necesitan. Pensar en una masificación absoluta del sistema universitario es un error porque, entre otras cosas, porque no necesitamos tantos universitarios en el mundo y más bien lo que necesitamos son muchos profesionales de calidad con perfiles que trabajen y cooperen entre ellos y que al mismo tiempo sus trayectorias puedan ser articuladas, ¿no? Entonces ahí hay una necesidad de empezar a pensar también en términos de la trayectoria educativa. ¿Qué estamos haciendo como política pública mirando, digamos, a nuestros egresados de la universidad secundaria? ¿Quiénes deberían ir a qué tipo de formación? ¿En dónde se va a invertir para que esa inversión pueda efectivamente, digamos, tener un retorno? Y lo otro es, recogiendo el comentario de mi compañera anterior, es aprovechar los temas de virtualización, que digamos, a veces se cree que la virtualización es una forma de reducir costos, cuando no es así, ¿no? La virtualización de calidad es muy costosa, supone una inversión importantísima en países como el mío, donde la conectividad es muy baja y además es muy mala, pero efectivamente constituye una inversión a futuro, ¿no? Hay que ir transitando, además, creo yo, digamos, a obtener recursos de aprendizaje, de enseñanza-aprendizaje no corporativos, ¿no? Ir pensando cada vez más en formas colaborativas, de open access, de sistemas de programación abierto que permiten también que diferentes públicos puedan ir accediendo a sistemas de interconexión de información que son hoy día claves para los sistemas de formación, sin hablar además de la necesidad de los sistemas de investigación, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Carmela. Andrew, would you like to jump in?
Good morning, everyone. I'm certainly in agreement with the statements as presented by my colleague. In terms of funding for higher education, we've seen that the pandemic has demonstrated to us that when there is a crisis, funding becomes available, makes itself available, because the will then to do something happens because there is this push that takes place. And we've seen the response of higher education over the period in terms of the movement to online learning, where a lot of institutions who are not focused on expanding their distance education offerings and their online learning in terms of developing the infrastructure during the pandemic period, because the options were there was actually no options for many institutions. The funding came and infrastructure came. So my thoughts are that when we think about funding, because of the direction in which higher education is going, and because of the context of the pandemic, which is not really over, and education is not going back to how it used to be, I think the funding is something that would fall in place as countries continue to look at reinventing the way that the public universities operate. It's my...
Thank you, colleagues. I can see quite a lot of questions are now coming through, and this is wonderful that we'll be able to take up some of these. Let me put two together which have come through, because I think they connect nicely. They relate to the environment. So the first question asks, how can the university, and I think here we should think holistically about all kinds of higher education institutions. So how can higher education institutions help students develop a sense of responsibility of the health of our planet? Should, for example, some environment responsibility workshops be included in every discipline? So that's one question. And then the other in relation asks, should environment issues be a transversal axis in the curriculum design at all educational levels? So let me ask anybody who would like to respond to that question about the environment.
Well, if I may jump in, on this one. Climate change is a very, very important issue to us, and in terms of discussing the future of our planet. And having said this, I think that, and it's my opinion, that just as first-year university courses, math and modes of reasoning is mandatory, that some sort of environment course that deals with environmental responsibility, as Dr. Pais, I think, mentioned earlier on in the chat, should be part of every university first-year program. Of course, that would lay the factual foundation for students to go on, because we must understand that outside of this, there's a lot of information that students get online, and there are persons who are saying that climate change still is not real. So I think it's important that universities should play their part in laying that factual foundation for every university student by making a course on environmental responsibility mandatory. I don't think we should graduate students without them having a course like this. That's just my opinion, because of course we have in first-year students who take various courses as electives. I think that environmental responsibility should not be really an option. That's just my opinion for first-year university students.
Thank you, Andrew. Mpine?
I agree with you, Andrew, very much about that. But I think we should even take it a step further, where we start right at the beginning, when they start school. Every child should be exposed to environmental issues right at the beginning. How do we deal with pollution? We live in an arid country in South Africa, but we are not even thinking about water. We are not even thinking about how we preserve water in a country where water is a scarcity. And in the continent where there's drought, we don't even think about other issues and other ways of doing things. And part of the reason is that we did not grow up with the culture of understanding that water is a scarcity and water is a need and it's a requirement. And for me, we need to start very early on. And by the time we get to universities, then that's when you start developing researchers and engineers and lawyers and all these people who are going to make sure that this thing that is such a scarcity and this thing that is threatening the climate and threatening the world is being taken seriously. And again, we go back to who's going to fund it. The school is full, and higher education is full of programs that are irrelevant. We just take out those programs out and include things that are relevant for today and for the future. And for me, that's very, very critical, rather than just saying, we want to add instead of just removing the things that are no longer working. Thank you.
Thank you also for bringing up the issue of the connectivity of education across all levels. Carmela or Sherry, would either of you like to add in? Otherwise, we have a lot of questions that we can move to.
Okay, then we shall move to our next question. And we have here, how can higher education become more relevant if research done at universities prioritizes international aspects and do not necessarily focus on local issues? Who would like to step further and answer this question?
Sí, yo ahí tal vez comentarles, miren, una anécdota. El año 2010 yo empecé a enseñar en una universidad empresarial, ¿no? En Lima. La sala de cómputo era una sala que era usada para muchos cursos. Yo enseñaba un curso de metodología. Bueno, la parte de atrás de la sala de cómputo tenía una enorme foto de Wall Street, ¿no? Porque muchas de estas veces, o sea, la sala se utilizaba también para una serie de simulaciones en la bolsa de valores. Todo bien. ¿Qué era lo paradójico de esta anécdota? Era mayo del año 2010, había comenzado una enorme crisis internacional justamente por el uso de malas prácticas en los temas de inversión internacional en la bolsa de valores, digamos, Wall Street a nivel mundial, ¿no? en la universidad, en la currícula, en las clases, no había ningún tipo de reflexión crítica sobre lo que estaba ocurriendo hacia afuera, más allá de la recepción de noticias, y seguía, digamos, este label atrás, ¿no? De publicidad de un modelo que nos estaba llevando en un momento en tiempo real a una situación de crisis global y que por supuesto afectaba de manera muy particular a las economías, digamos, más débiles, que siguen igualmente encadenadas. Entonces, creo que es importantísimo que las comunidades universitarias, los docentes y los investigadores, empecemos a producir un conocimiento crítico y pertinente ante las grandes, digamos, contradicciones de nuestros propios modelos de desarrollo, ¿no? Y eso es algo que tiene que ver con la revisión curricular, ¿no? Seguir entendiendo que los cursos de derechos humanos, comercio justo, temas medioambientales, digamos, no son un curso más en tu formación de, no sé, tu formación de la carrera jurídica, ¿no? Muchos abogados efectivamente llevan, por mencionar una carrera que conozco, ¿no? Llevan muchísimos cursos y uno más de derechos humanos como si fuera un tema diferente a lo que se ve, cuando justamente la importancia de temas como derechos humanos es que son transversales a la formación en derecho tributario, constitucional, internacional, económico, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, creo que es muy importante que tiene que haber, como decía, en un retorno a un giro epistemológico de entender que los temas vinculados a inclusión, a derechos, a sostenibilidad, son vitales para la sostenibilidad incluso del propio sistema. Digamos, un sistema educativo que no incluye no es sostenible, ¿no? Porque además va a operar en comunidades locales con alto nivel de conflicto. Una educación superior que no esté orientada deontológicamente hacia la formación en valores, principios, hacia la paz, y eso supone, como digo, la revisión de qué hacemos en aula, de cuáles son nuestras prácticas pedagógicas, por ejemplo, en cosas fundamentales como la inclusión de poblaciones no tradicionales, ¿no? Seguir creyendo cuestiones como que la educación intercultural es una educación para indígenas, es un error. Necesitamos educación intercultural, por supuesto, en comunidades indígenas, pero la necesitamos en las universidades de élite para que lleguen a entender cómo funciona también el mundo en términos de diversidad cultural, ¿no? Son cuestiones que deben cruzar y ser transversales, creo yo, en todos los niveles, digamos, educativos. En ese sentido, la investigación que muestre evidencia en términos de cómo la inclusión enriquece a las comunidades universitarias, ¿no? Enriquece a las comunidades educativas porque da otros puntos de vista, aporta otros saberes, aporta otras prácticas, ¿no? Creo que ahí hay un trabajo muy importante por hacer, porque si no, terminamos generando educación para otros, ¿no? Para otros grupos, casi como educación para indígenas, educación para personas con discapacidad, educación para mujeres, ¿cierto? Cuando lo que necesitamos es empezar a convivir, para empezar, dentro de nuestras propias comunidades universitarias, porque la educación tiene esta riqueza, que es un aprendizaje con otros, ¿no? No es un aprendizaje, digamos, solo de contenido en términos textuales, sino de práctica, ¿no? Y hemos perdido mucho de eso también en la virtualización, sin embargo, también es una oportunidad, entonces tenemos ahí un trabajo por hacer, pero si no desarrollamos una ética educativa, una suerte de práctica de justicia educacional, digamos que es uno de los paradigmas nuevos, vamos a seguir construyendo un conocimiento que está como en los textos, pero que no empapa la vida cotidiana de docentes, gestores, autoridades y por supuesto estudiantes, ¿no?
Any other comment from our speakers?
Okay, thank you very much, Carmela, for that response. I'm going to ask a question that was posted about, it's a little bit connected, about moral and ethical value programs and how those might be added into the higher education curriculum. The question also helps us think about the global interconnections of higher education by asking how we can support students who have high caliber to achieve their higher education goals and their career goals, but who are unprivileged, and come from, as the question says, underdeveloped countries. So I think that's a nice question for us to think about the kind of global ramifications. Mpine, I don't know if your hand is a new hand for this one, so let me ask you anyway to take the floor.
It's a new hand. This is very interesting conversation that we're having. one other thing that I think we keep on going back to, even when we are trying to go forward, is that we are married to the traditions of higher education. We are married to disciplines. We think that something has to come from somewhere in order for us to do things. And I think this whole process is actually questioning the assumptions that higher education is operating in a certain way. And the only way that we can do that is to undo a whole lot of things, and maybe even starting them gradually, but we need to think differently. For an example, we have the networked learning, the technological network learning. These days, when you want to know anything about anything or anybody, you can just Google and find YouTubes and all sorts of things. And that allows us to move away from what we are used to. Our students go on YouTube to find out more about what they want to do. And here we are talking about student-centeredness and students who are supposed to be sharing knowledge. Why don't we allow them to come up with certain things that they think or they see important? And that's when we engage, rather than we become the ones who know what ethics means and who knows what climate change means. Let them come up with those things, and let's allow students maybe our assessment should be based on what comes from the community, what comes from society, and let's share knowledge together in order for us to move forward and come up with a concept that there are no right or wrong answers. They are just answers that are going to help us moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mpine. And your comments remind me again of the recently launched report, which Sobhi Tawil talked about, in which the emphasis is really on doing this together. In fact, they didn't envisage the title that they have chosen, but they explain, that this became important because it was really critical to have this word together. If we're going to do this, if we're going to try to imagine better futures for everybody, then it's something that we have to do collectively. So thank you for that response. Colleagues, would anybody else like to take the floor in response to the question? Okay, I think then let's see, we've got tons of questions, and the only difficulty is going to be which ones we're going to have time to raise. Sarah, is there something that you would like to put forward, perhaps something that we've received in Espanol?
We have one in Spanish, and it says, es un escenario demasiado positivo. ¿Qué es lo nuevo para garantizar la agenda o sus objetivos distinto a los establecidos por la educación para todos? Si sabemos que los tomadores de decisiones responden a las agendas a la agenda educativa electoral y en todo caso agenda de modelo de negocios de las IES privadas. I can read it in English. It is too positive a scenario. What is new to guarantee the agenda or its objectives different from those established by Education for All or others? If we know that the decision maker responds to electoral educational agendas, and in any case, the agenda of the business model of private higher educations.
Awesome.
Maybe this would be a nice point to maybe talk about recommendations to policymakers. I don't know who would like to answer that question or to that commentary.
Yeah. So I think sort of in the course of the conversation, we've had a little bit of an opportunity to raise perhaps some connected issues. So as you suggested, Sarah, perhaps, as we're sort of drawing to the end of the webinar today, if colleagues here would like to put forward recommendations and let us know, who are you thinking about here? Are you thinking about policymakers? Are you thinking about people who are doing research in higher education? Are you thinking about students? Are you thinking about civil society? I think that also helps us, because I know when we've been working on this Futures of Higher Education project, what we're trying to do is create the conditions in which we can have these conversations. So I think from a UNESCO perspective, what we're not trying to do is to say to people, you have to pursue this particular way of doing things, because there are so many different contexts and so many different issues around the world that have to be taken into consideration. So I suppose in thinking about these recommendations, that will also help us to understand, how can we in our own context and with our own needs and issues shape that conversation. So over to you, our speakers, and we look forward to your recommendations. Please, Sherry.
So from my perspective, I think one of my recommendations for the policymakers would be the redefinition of the higher education workforce. So traditionally, we've been talking about stakeholders for higher education or teachers for higher education. We don't really talk about the personnel that are involved in higher education. So from my experience of working with teachers, specifically since the pandemic, who have been in charge of developing online and blended teaching and learning activities, I found, for example, technical personnel, or if you call it educational technologists, are often neglected in this process because they are more in a support, like they play the role of supportive, they play a supportive role in this process. And too often we only look at, the people who are in front of the camera, which are the teachers, and their needs, like for example, their needs for professional development are neglected. So I would suggest, or I would recommend the policymakers to have, to take another look at all the workforce that are involved in higher education, not just those who are in front of the camera, who are the ones who are directly facing the students, but also those who are behind, supporting the teachers and supporting those who actually make higher education activities possible. So that would be my recommendation.
Thank you, Sherry. Carmela?
Sí, yo creo que ahí también es bien importante volver, digamos, ahí admito mi tendencia a las prácticas institucionales, ¿no? Porque a veces cuando hablamos de, digamos, de ética, de buenas prácticas, pareciera que fuera algo muy abstracto, pero en realidad hay herramientas que funcionan para la incorporación, digamos, de estos valores y principios en la práctica cotidiana, ¿no? Y esto tiene que ver con la implementación desde políticas de regulación, en términos de evaluación, digamos, supervisión de algunos temas vinculados a la calidad o incluso a evitar prácticas discriminatorias, pero también a la generación de buenas prácticas dentro de las propias instituciones, ¿no? Que tienen además digamos, que hablar con una serie de incentivos, ¿no? Entonces estoy pensando, por ejemplo, cómo una universidad va a poder formar, ¿cierto?, a sus estudiantes si no tiene implementado, no sé, mecanismos de prevención y sanción frente al hostigamiento sexual, por mencionar un tema relevante también por el día, ¿no? Entonces, claro, nosotros queremos universidades que aporten a la equidad de género. La equidad de género es un principio que está ahorita vinculado más a los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, pero si no incorporamos eso como una obligatoriedad y como una buena práctica en las universidades, que tienen que tener sistemas, digamos, de prevención o investigación, no vamos a poder, digamos, atajar, hablar y acoger a las, digamos, a las comunidades que dentro de nuestras propias universidades pueden pasar por esas situaciones, y eso tiene que ver con docentes, con estudiantes, con trabajadoras, ¿cierto? O trabajadores, en el caso también de ciertas minorías, ¿no? O pensar en temas como educación inclusiva, ¿no? Queremos, digamos, currículas que promuevan la inclusión de personas con diferentes habilidades, pero no podemos hablar de educación inclusiva sin incluirlos a ellos dentro del propio proceso educativo. Pensemos, por ejemplo, en uno de los temas que hubo hace 2 días también en un webinar del instituto, ¿no? Vinculado a los temas de inclusión con personas con discapacidad, donde había alguien hablando de su propia problemática, ¿cierto? De cómo se vive la educación superior también desde el punto de vista de alguien con habilidades distintas. Entonces yo creo que, digamos, es sobre terreno y sobre estas prácticas que son institucionales, normativas, legales, pero también interpersonales, que podemos ir construyendo un sentido, digamos, más amplio, más justo también de la educación superior, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, Carmela, para sus palabras. Andrew or Mpine, would you like to offer Some final comments before, unfortunately, we're going to have to
Okay.
draw today's session to a close. Mpine, please.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Upon reflects, when I'm trying to reflect on this whole thing and trying to figure out who should be the relevant person to take on this bandwork, to take on this baton, I thought of the report itself. The report draws from different people and different entities and all those things. And those are for me, those are our starting point, people who have actually thought about what higher education may look like in 2050. Because I don't see the role of policymakers, but probably when they can be trained about that, because there's a big difference between a policymaker and a person who thinks about the future. I don't want to call them a futurist, but probably that's the term you use. Policymakers' role is to look at the development of policies from 0 to 5 years. Their horizon is very limited to that. And then you have futurists who are thinking of 2050, even beyond. Now, these are different roles that are going to be considered by these two groups in terms of the horizon that they're looking at. And then with the futures, it is not what do you think it is? It can change. It has a lot of things. COVID can come in and maybe multiple things can come in while we are still dreaming about this particular image that we have in mind. So my proposal here is that there may not be the right people or whatever, but probably what we can do is to grow emerging futures researchers in universities and start beginning to think about that, because policies are going to be there, are going to guide us for strategies, but futures work is not guiding us for strategies. It's just giving us images of what we may think about in the future. And I'll just give you a very brief example of what the danger of not thinking about the future is like, and I'll keep quiet. In Africa, we inherited a colonial education system. And when colonizers left, we were left with nothing. We didn't have the models to follow. So we just followed the model that was left behind by the colonizers. And we continued with it. But that model is elitist. That model was meant to subjugate the people. That model was totally irrelevant to the development agenda of what we are doing, because we never sat back and think about what is it that we want higher education to do for us, not tomorrow, but in 30, 40, 50 years' time. And I think as higher education people, or even people who are interested in this field, we should begin and include everybody in the process. We should begin to start a movement towards that goal, because we cannot do it and looking for higher people while we are saying students should be also student-centered and they should be participatory and all those things. We need to start a movement. These reports should follow up on those people that spoke in these reports, so that we start developing something that will move us forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are very powerful words, and wonderful to bring them in as we kind of close this event, but continue, open a new set of reflections. Andrew?
Yes, I just want to say that some of the concerns around some of the questions has been related to access, really. In terms of how can the policymakers play a role or make a difference. And in UNESCO's vision, in terms of secondary education or education for all, there's been a massive growth in the expansion of access to secondary school education, which has not really effectively translated into that massive growth at the level of higher education. And a question was posed earlier on, that a person who may be gifted but who do not have the means and to get into higher education. I think there was a question surrounding that particular area. It all boils down to access and how do policymakers view education? Would they see higher education now as a public good that the state must defend and provide funding so that it could be expanded, access could be expanded? How do you view mobility in terms of all this comes into looking at the futures into 2050. And in order for us to see, to realize that vision, the policymakers, of course, have a critical role to play. And we as educators and those who have the vision need to actively share that vision with the policymakers for the expansion of access and for us to see education go on where we want it to be as for the report. That's just my synopsis on this.
That's a wonderful synopsis. I don't know where to start, but thank you. Actually, let me start this time by thanking our participants. There's, a very active chat that's going on. I'm really happy that we've been able to take up some of the questions. I know that we haven't even scraped too deep down under the surface of the questions that have come, but thank you very much to everybody who's joined us today to celebrate the launch of our new public consultation report on the futures of higher education, who's now heard the official announcement that we will be now moving into a new phase of a global youth consultation, who can now consider yourself, officially somebody who's committed to taking up our call to action, to becoming a futures thinker. It sometimes feels difficult to imagine a world in 2050 or multiple worlds in 2050. But what we've seen in the report, what we've seen in the conversation today, what we've seen in the questions is that actually we can do that. It's entirely possible to think about the futures. And so the next step then, I think for everybody, for all of us, and this is an opportunity to really thank our panelists for helping us to think so deeply and for raising some really important points today. So the question for all of us is, we can equip ourselves with the tools for thinking about the futures. So what are the next steps that we're going to take? How are we going to collectively get to those better futures for all? So with that, Sarah, would you like to close the webinar and wrap up for today?
Thanks, Emma. Well, before we say goodbye, we invite the panelists to take part in the closure of this event with the official portrait, with the help of our technical team. So please, we want your best smile for the final picture. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We have our director also on the screen. And so thanks, and on behalf of Frances Pedro, our director, and of the team at UNESCO IESALC, we would like to thank not only the speakers who participated in today's event, but all the people who participated in the public consultation on the futures of higher education. We also thank you all for attending this event. We have already shared in the chat, in the Zoom chat, the link to the interactive report, and also the link to the report in PDF format to be downloaded, and also links to our microsite on the futures of higher education, where we have all the updates of the new phases of the report in both Spanish and English. And we invite you to visit our website for all the details. There are more conversations and debates coming up regarding on the futures of higher education. So muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Los invitamos a conectarse a nuestros próximos eventos, chequeando el calendario de eventos en la web, así como en nuestras redes sociales. Also, before we go, I would like to remind you and let you know that we will publish the recording of today's webinar, and with subtitles both in English and Spanish For those who had problems with the connections, we'll keep you posted on the forthcoming products of this conversation. So thank you. Muchas gracias. Have a nice day. Que tengan un muy buen día.
Gracias, adiós.
Bye. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.